Hello, everyone, and welcome to the YMCA of Greater Seattle's Suicide Prevention Webinar Learning Series, where we hear from behavioral health experts both inside and outside of the YMCA about important topics around suicide. My name is David English, and I am a Community Growth Manager for the YMCA. I want to give a quick and sincere thank you to the Washington State Healthcare Authority for supporting and the Y Social Impact Center for your work in organizing this series. If you're just joining us for the first time, I invite you to look at the chat box for a link to our website where our previous webinars are located. As always, we will be recording this webinar and we'll have it available on our website as soon as possible. In addition, please check the chat box where our team will be providing helpful resources and links that you can use after the webinar is over. These will also be sent out in a follow-up email to all registered attendees. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to post it in the chat and our team will answer during the webinar or at the questions portion at the end. And for those watching the recording, please email mburns@seattleymca.org for any resources. Finally, we want to say thank you to everyone for joining, and if you or someone you know is experiencing a crisis, there are supports available. Please use the National Crisis Lifeline at 800-273-8255. Now, I am excited to introduce the webinar for today, Stopping the Downward Spiral of Suicidal Behavior, presented by Dr. Jim Mazza of the University of Washington's School Psychology Program in the College of Education. Dr. Jim Mazza is the co-author of the DBT Steps A Social Emotional Learning Curriculum for middle and high school age students. He received his master's and PhD in school psychology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he is now a professor at the University of Washington, Seattle, where he has been for over 25 years teaching and conducting research in the field of adolescent mental health. There's so much more to say, but I want to make sure that Dr. Mazza has enough time. So without further ado, I present to you Dr. Jim Mazza. Jim, you can take it away.
All right, thanks, David. Appreciate the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for joining me in your evening here to talk about a really important topic regarding youth suicidal behavior and trying to figure out ways that we can stop the downward spiral. And so we know that this spiral is likely going to be increasing a bit with the COVID situation and the pandemic, and so we hear a lot about the isolation. We're going to try to talk about that, and I'll try to integrate some of that into my discussions and slides that we have. All right, next slide. So here's a chart that the latest chart that I was able to obtain from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, and they keep track of our national suicide statistics for all ages. And what I wanted to highlight here is that you can see in the circled red line that suicide is the second leading cause of death from ages 10 years old all the way to 34. All right, and we look at 10 years old, that's actually 4th grade. And so we've got a real situation, a problem that's happening regarding this means of death. And for adolescents, interesting, that age group of 15 to 19, that group actually, suicide used to be the 3rd leading cause of death. Homicide used to be significantly higher when I was a graduate student and doing some of my early work. And suicide has been continually going up and up and up. And so interestingly, in the far right-hand column, when it looks at, when you see all ages, and you see suicide down there as the 10th leading cause of death across all ages, the other 9 deaths that are there, the other types of 9 deaths are all coming down in the last 10 years. Suicide is the only one that's actually going up. And so we do have kind of a crisis. It's a silent crisis because people don't want to talk about it. And so there's a stigma that's there. So we do want to, I just really appreciate the Y having me to be a part of this conversation, a part of the series, so that we can help educate you, the parents, you, the instructors, you, the people that are working with youth regarding this topic. Next slide. So a little closer to home, right? This is where we get information from the Washington Healthy Youth Survey. So these are students within our state boundaries here telling us their indicators of depression and anxiety. And keep in mind, this is from 2018. We haven't seen the 2020 data yet. We think that that data is going to even be worse than this data. So you can see here that 1/3 of all of our kids in 8th grade are already feeling depressed. 40% in 10th and roughly 40% in 12th grade. So that's 4 out of 10, that's a lot. If we look at feeling anxious, over half our 8th graders, over 2/3 of our 10th graders, and over 2/3 of our 12th graders are experiencing anxiety. And that's important because we know that mental health and mental difficulties and challenges actually are related to suicidal behaviors, start to increase some of those thoughts about suicide. And then finally, can't control the worry. So this is not only do they feel a little bit depressed or have some anxiety, they don't have some of the skills to control that. And that's worrisome from an education standpoint, because we want our youth who are going to graduate from high school, go into maybe college or higher ed, or out to their jobs. We want to give them skills to be able to provide their strategies for situations that happen to them. So that'll be important. So again, pretty high number, 60% of our seniors can't control their worry. That is kind of a bit alarming to me. All right, next slide. What does that look like for suicidal behavior? All right, for suicidal behavior specifically, we're looking at 1 out of 5 kids in the last 12 months thought about or considered suicide. That's a high number. That number even goes up in 10th grade and slightly coming down. That's probably actually due to chance. That's probably just noise. We're a little bit higher rate in 12th grade, right? So we're above the 1 out of 5. It's 1 out of 4.8, 4.9 in 10th and 12th grade. These numbers are likely just going to go up because of the pandemic, and because of we know that the challenges of the pandemic and the trauma that everybody's experienced by being isolated is probably exacerbating, making our mental health situations worse. So 20, 23, and 22% for considering suicide made a plan to attempt suicide. So that's a higher lethal behavior. And we look at this and we look at basically 1 out of 7 8th graders, 1 out of 7 10th graders, 1 out of 7 12th graders. So we're looking at that. Maybe it's 1 out of 6 actually, 10th and 12th graders. We're looking at this going like, boy, that's a lot of kids that are thinking about a plan to die. So what can we do about that? And then the percent of kids who have attempted suicide in the past 12 months, 1 out of 10 8th graders, 1 out of 10 10th graders, and roughly 1 out of 10 12th graders. So 1 out of 10 youth have attempted suicide in the last 12 months. And so when we have these large high schools that might be 1,500 to 2,000 students, you're looking at a school with 2,000 students, 200 of those kids making a suicide attempt in the past year. That's a lot of kids. That's actually a crisis. We need to be concerned about that. And in Washington State, on average, 2 youth die by suicide per week. And I'm not going to be surprised if that number starts to go up a little bit when we look at our 2020 data. All right, so we do have a situation where we need to be alarmed, all right, about this issue of suicide, and not to panic though. All right, the good news is that most of these kids who are thinking about suicide, they survive this. They get past this. Those that attempt suicide, most of them survive their attempts. So that's also good news. What we'd like to do is see less kids attempting suicide, seeing less kids in that emotional pain by us being able to talk to them, whether we're parents, whether we're instructors, whether we're Y coaches, whatever that is, right? Being able to talk about this topic in a way that makes sense, in a way that is validating to the youth will be really important. And hopefully I'll be able to give you a few kernels, a few strategies that you'll be able to do that with some of the groups that you're working with. All right. Thank you. So one of the things to help stop the spiraling is to learn, why does someone become suicidal? What is behind their thinking process and what occurs in their lives that they become suicidal? And so I want to tell you there's 2 theories, current theories that we're currently using these days to try to help explain suicidal behavior. There's quite a bit of overlap, all right? So the first one is what's called the interpersonal theory of suicide. This is Thomas Joiner's model, and he's got 3 major components that happen here. So what he talks about is that kids who are trying to belong to school, trying to make a friendship group, trying to be a part of the integration of school and to be a part of their class, if they're being pushed away and not being let in, not being accepted for who they are, we call that thwarted belongingness. So that these kids are trying to belong in their school bonding, school spirit, school activities. It could be community activities, and people are telling them, no, you're a freak. You don't belong here. go to a different school, that type of situation. They don't have a lot of friends. The isolation that's happened during the pandemic is only making those situations that much worse about the thought of belongingness. So that's the first big cluster. The second is what we call perceived burdensomeness. And if you've been an adolescent before, if I have mainly adults on this call, you know during your own adolescence that there were times when you just had some drama in your life. There were times that you didn't like your personality, you didn't like your body, you didn't like everything that was happening to you, you didn't like your grades, and you were like, oh my God, this is ridiculous, right? That's the perceived burdensomeness that adolescents start to think without people checking with them, saying, empowering them that they are talented, that they have a lot of things going for them, that they've got good skills. If we don't check in with them that way, they start to perceive themselves as just being the people that are scolded all the time. You're wrong. You're not good at this. You suck at this, right? People don't talk to them. So they start to perceive themselves as being burdensome. Now, the key word here in this second cluster is perceived. Adolescents' perception is their reality. Whether we see that or not is very different from a parent. And I've got 2 adolescents, right? And there are times when I have to kind of just help my adolescents just check the facts, like, whoa, wait a minute. You know, you're not a bad kid. Yes, we sometimes yell. Yes, we want you to do some things differently. And that's just behavior. That's not you as an entire kid. All right. And so we want to make sure that our youth are seeing some of the talents, some of the benefits, some of the uniqueness that they can bring to relationships, to the family, to school, and so forth. So perceived burdensomeness, if they don't see that, and if they don't feel bonded to school and isolated, that's an issue. So thought of belongingness and perceived burdensomeness overlapping is hard for our kids. That's pretty stressful already. It's not until though the third component comes into play and overlaps with the other 2 that we have an adolescent or an adult that's at risk for making a serious suicide attempt. And that's that capacity to engage in suicidal behavior. The capacity to go against your body's instincts to survive and live. And in order to do that, you've got to get away from those inhibitions. You've got to be able to figure out a way to bypass your body's instinct to fight and to live. And this is why we see a lot of our youth, a lot of our adults, they'll make their suicide attempt being having a lot of alcohol, having drugs in their system, so that they bypass their natural safety mechanisms. All right. And so it's not until all 3 of those come together that we talk about a serious suicide attempt. We also know, if we work with youth and some kids who have thought about suicide, maybe even made some attempts, all right, some minor attempts, low lethality attempts, they're practicing. They're engaging in that practice of getting their body used to experiencing a lot of pain, used to the thought that maybe I will die this time. And so they're kind of practicing to get better at this capacity to engage in suicidal behavior. So that's Thomas Joiner's model. We'll come back to talking about how we can intervene and talk about skills that we can use for all 3 of those clusters. All right, next slide. All right, David Klonsky's model looks a little bit different. He talks about a 3-step theory, or the 3ST theory, where you're already experiencing some mental health difficulties. You're already in emotional pain. Thomas Joiner says that emotional pain comes from thwarted belongingness and from perceived burdensomeness. Klonsky already starts with, you're already there, all right? You're in pain and you've got feelings of hopelessness. It's a yes-no decision-making tree. If the answer is no, you're in emotional pain and the decision-making piece, hold on. Sorry about that. We had an alarm that just went off. So I was able to mute the mic. Hopefully I didn't hurt anybody else's ears besides mine. All right. And so Klonsky's model says you have to have the emotional pain that's there, similar to the overlap between thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness. And then we also have to have our youth feel like there's not going to be any change, that this is just how my life's going to be. And that's kind of our definition of hopelessness, where we're not going to be able to get out of this. This is going to be a lifelong situation of emotional pain and agony, right? If that's a yes, we start to think about suicide, which takes us to step 2. Is your pain greater? Is that pain that you're experiencing, that emotional pain, greater than your connectedness? And here's where that belongingness comes in. Is it greater than how you feel when you're with your friends? Is it greater than your connection to that school and the school bonding and the connection to teams or the activities that you'll be doing with other people? If that connectedness is strong, it acts like a buffer. It kind of mitigates, it reduces the impact of the suicidal ideation to moderate. It's less, it's not going to go anywhere, it's not going to advance and become more severe. If the answer is yes, that the pain is greater than the social connection, that's much more problematic, because now we don't have that protective factor and we start thinking about reasons why being dead is more important than being alive. And so if that is a yes, then we have stronger suicidal ideation. And with stronger suicidal ideation, we start to think of more lethal means, more lethal ways to attempt suicide. And so now at that third step, are you capable of attempting suicide? That looks just like Thomas Joiner's model of capable for suicide, right? Capability of engaging in suicidal behavior. If no, we have an individual that just thinks about suicide because they're not going to engage in that. If yes, if the capability is there to engage in that, then there's often a suicide attempt. All right, so that's kind of the two models. Next slide. So what do we do with that? I have a bias. You need to know that I have a bias, right? So I am the first author of what's called the DBT Skills in Schools book. In this book is a curriculum for middle school and high school students to help them with their emotional dysregulation. All right, this skills book and this curriculum cover the four major components of dialectical behavior therapy: mindfulness, distress tolerance, emotional regulation, interpersonal effectiveness. Why did we choose to follow the DBT intervention? Because it has the best evidence-based intervention and empirical data to support individuals who are highly suicidal. We already have that from the clinical studies. What we're not doing is getting this really important clinical intervention into the schools for everyone to use before they become clients or patients of a clinical situation or clinical practice or in a hospital. We'd like to not see those ER visits and being a patient in a hospital. Next slide. So the idea behind the Steps 8 curriculum and the idea behind me being a school psychologist who's working to prevent suicide is that once we have someone engaging in our suicidal behavior, they're already here at this downstream spot. They're already over the waterfall. Things have happened. There's a crisis that's occurred, and now we have to do a lot of intervention and crisis management. That's a much harder lift. If instead we went upstream to tier 1 and started building a fence around this river so kids could not fall in. We start to build protective barriers and factors so that we give kids strategies ahead of time. So when the drama does hit during adolescence and when they don't like some of their life, they have skills that they've already practiced to help them with that. All right. The midstream piece here, that tier 2, is when we're already doing interventions to help with maybe like say alcohol use, drug use. We're helping intervene where it's risky sex or bullying, where we know those factors are related to some of their suicidal behavior. So we can also kind of intervene, bring those kids in from the current and to the shore by giving them some strategies through risky sex prevention, drug and alcohol prevention, and so forth. All right, next slide, please. So here's the emphasis, right? We're going to focus on giving all kids skills. So it's a universal upstream program because every kid could use some of these skills, not only for their current life, also for their future life, right? So if they're not in a struggle now, you know, they may be in 6 months, in 6 weeks, in 6 hours. We don't know. The idea is to give them the strategies to use and to practice before the crisis is there. When they're in the middle of the crisis, it's really hard to teach them skills. They're not in a place to be educated, right? And so it's similar to like if an adolescent has been picked up and is in the youth detention center, giving them a lecture while they're in jail is probably not the right time, right? They already know that they messed up. What we want to do is give them the lecture or give them the strategies before they get to that detention center. All right, that'd be the idea. All right, next slide. So how do we do this? We do this, and go ahead and hit the return a couple times. I think that slide's going to have us. There we go. And 2 more times, I think. Perfect. Thank you. We're going to do this by trying to figure out where our adolescent needs our help and when they need the help. All right. So for our adolescents are struggling a lot in the moment, and they're really angry, or they're really sad, or they're feeling a lot of guilt and shame, where their emotions are driving the bus, we're going to be on the left side of our teeter-totter, right? We're going to be on that acceptance and validation side, where we're going to use mindfulness skills and distress tolerance skills. This is a place where we as parents can say, you're right, this situation sucks. I am sorry you're in a lot of pain. This is not fair. We want to accept our adolescents for where they are. That way they don't see it as being burdensome, right? We can match where they are as far as what they're telling us. We might not understand the pain, we don't have to. We can simply be with them when they're struggling. That'll be helpful. When that pain comes down a bit, and when we're there helping them when they're struggling with pain, we keep them safe so they're not making things worse. We keep them safe so they're not engaging in self-harm or self-medicating behaviors, right? That emotion, that strong, intense emotion will start to come down. And once it comes down to a level where we can start to use some of their executive function again, we switch over to the teeter-totter on the red side there. So now we're on the right side of the teeter-totter, and we're looking at change and problem-solving skills. That's skills that we teach in the emotion regulation part, where they don't like the emotion that they're feeling. It's not too intense that they're in emotion mind. And so we're going to learn some strategies to change the intensity of the emotion of sadness or guilt or anger, so they're less likely to escalate into emotion mind. And then we're also going to teach them interpersonal effectiveness skills on how to gain some of that connectedness in schools, how to get some of the things that they want, that they're asking for, and how to say no to things that they don't want. That's the other side. So the big question is, how do you know which side of the teeter-totter? All right. We have a skill. We won't go into the details because we don't have a lot of time. That talks about our emotional thermometer. And that emotional thermometer is from 0 to 100. 0 being like comatose, asleep almost, and 100 like simply jumping out of the skin. They've never been more emotionally in pain. The emotion thermometer cutoff is roughly 65. So if you think your adolescent is above that 65, 2/3 of the way up, it's likely that they're in emotion mind, which means that their logical thinking is offline. They're not thinking logically. They're not thinking cognitively. They're thinking simply emotionally. And we, as all adults, we've been here, right? And matter of fact, we as adults sometimes get the same way. I do even, and I've written a curriculum. There are times when I get into a tussle with my kids or with my partner, and I get above there because I'm frustrated. And all of a sudden, all my thinking just goes to kaput. I don't think well. I'm just busy hollering, or I'm busy being mad, right? And so I don't think well. And so we want to make sure that when it's above that 65, we come over to the green side, this left side, and help our adolescents to validate what they're experiencing. Help our partners too. These work for adults as well. You're right, that sucks. You're right, that's a difficult situation. I'm sorry you're in that much pain. What can I do to help? Those are great starters for our adolescents to feel validated. They're great starters for our partners to feel validated. What can I do to help? The change side is actually implementing some of the skills, all right? Keep in mind, the distress tolerance skills are those for making sure it doesn't make anything worse. All right, next slide. Oh, thank you. We're going to cover these skills. Important to think on that blue box at the top, right? The rectangle, the big dialectic, 2 things happening at the same time. That's what a dialectic is. 2 opposite things happening at the same time. Is to figure out which side that we're on. And for you to say, well, how does that work? I'm wondering if in the audience here, if anybody has been in a situation where you've been involved in a relationship, call it longer than 3 months, right? Which is a long time for a relationship for an adolescent, right? That have you ever been in a situation where you've been angry at your partner and you love them at the same time? Has that ever happened? I don't know if there's a chat bar or whatever else, but you could put some yeses in there or Y's, whatever. Maybe there's places for David or Kato to take a look at that. I'm guessing anybody that's been in that 3-month or longer relationship has experienced that. I know I have. I've been married for 17 years, right? And you get into that where you can love somebody and not like them at that moment at the same time. It happens. That's a dialectic, right? Our kids go through the same thing. They get rejection from somebody, and they know that they've got some good skills too, some good qualities, and both they're having a hard time trying to figure out how do I reconcile both those things at the same time. That's what we're going to learn. So on the acceptance validation side, we're going to learn about wise mind. I'll talk about that, and we're going to learn what the tip skill is, right? The tip skill is a distress tolerance skill. On the emotion regulation side, I'll get to that one. Next slide. So one of the things about dialectics that's important to learn is that the word but erases the first half of a sentence. So when we talk to our adolescents or when we talk to our partners, I like the way you clean the house, but you forgot the bathroom. What do we hear? I forgot the bathroom. I messed up. When we talk to our adolescents, love your grades in math and language arts, but what happened in science? What is the adolescent here? I messed up in science. It negates how well they did in language arts and in math. And so we don't want but, which is we call a big eraser, right? What we want to do is use the word and. They did well in math and language arts. So I love your grades in math and language arts, and looks like science is still a challenge, right? I don't erase it. I'm honoring it. And I think that's important that we use the and in most of our statements, all right? Your first 3 laps in the mile were great, but that last lap stunk. What is the adolescent here? The last lap stunk, right? So the first 3 laps were great, and that last lap was really hard, right? Both are true at the same time. So it lays the foundation for multiple perspectives. So we can say, I understand you want the car, and I have to work in the morning, so I need my sleep. Not, but I have to work in the morning, and, right? I know you want to start dating, but you're too young. All they hear is, I'm too young, I'm too young, I'm too young. I know you want to start dating, and at this point, maybe we have to wait until you're 14 or 15. It lands differently. All right, next slide. Here's our wise mind. Our wise mind is actually the combination of a little bit of emotion mind and a little bit of reason mind. So we've got emotion mind where our amygdala is making all the decisions. This is where we usually mess up. This is where we get really angry and we yell at people and swear at people that we love dearly, and we wreck relationships. We wreck our job employment situations, right? That's one. The other is reasonable mind, where things are really kind of cool, very logical, very reasonable, not showing almost any emotion, right? And so we probably know some people that are in reasonable mind most of the time, and we probably know some people that are in emotion mind a lot of the time. The place that we think our adolescents function the most effectively, as well as adults function most effectively, is a combination of both, what we call our wise mind, what I know to be, rather than what I feel to be versus what I think to be, right? And so there are times, and I'm guilty of this, where I want to start being in reasonable. You know, my wife Liz will say to me, hey, this happened and this happened and this happened. And I'll say, well, did you try this or this? And she just like, she stops, she just puts her hand out and goes like, wait, I am not looking for you to solve my problem. I am looking for you just to listen. And I want to start solving the problem. So I have to be like, okay, I have to kind of check my a little bit of my reasonable mind to try to solve it and say, okay, I need to be back into wise mind and to just be there to validate her, right? So that I can show her that I hear her, what she's saying. You're right, that day stinks. Sorry that that happened. And then we can move on from there. Sometimes we just need a little bit of validation of our day to help us be more effective in what we do, all right? So our wise mind tries to be doing things one thing in the moment, which is one of our house skills, being non-judgmental, and then we should do what works. And sometimes that's hard for us. We might have rules in our house that are simply rules in our house. Because I said so. I can't tell you how many times I heard that from my father. Because I said so. And I gotta tell you, it's invalidating. How about you give me a reason why? Not because you said so, but give me a reason why. I'm concerned about your safety. The person that you're dating right now has reckless behavior. Your grades aren't high enough. Give me some rationale. Give me some reason, right? Our adolescents can think about those things. They understand that piece. All right, so that's what's important. So being in wise mind, we teach this. So our kids start to get this vocabulary of, are you in your wise mind? Am I making a wise-minded decision? And parents, we can say, geez, it looks like you're over 65. Or you can ask your adolescent, on a scale of 1 to 100, where are you on your emotion thermometer? And they're like 85. You're like, bingo. For parent, I'm going like, they're in emotion mind. They're in emotion mind. I got to make sure that they don't make things worse. All right. And so I think that that'll be important. All right. And so we want to make sure that we're helping them understand that making decisions when they're in emotion mind usually is like pouring gas on a fire. It makes things worse. Things explode. All right. So I think that'll be important. All right. Next slide. Here's what I was talking about this crisis thermometer above 65. When we're above 65, what we want to be able to do is use one of the skills that we talk about regarding tipping our body chemistry, right? And the TIPS is an acronym for temperature, intense exercise, and paced breathing, right? And so what we want to be able to do with temperature is if we have someone that's in emotion mind and it's kind of driving their decision making, putting cold water on their face, especially just under the eyes, on the high cheekbones. I mean, cold water. This is 55 degrees, 60-degree water, and holding it there while they're holding their breath starts to kick in what we know as the dive reflex. It's part of all of our body's systems, part of the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and everything starts to shut down in the dive reflex. It also then pulls down the intensity of the emotion that you're experiencing, right? There may be adolescents that don't want to put cold water on their face, right? Maybe they just got done doing their makeup. Maybe they it's too painful to them. So get something that's frozen or cold to put there. Keep it there for roughly 30 seconds, all right? Take it off, put it back on, take it off, put it back on, and then you'll be like, I'm still mad. I'm still frustrated. You're like, yes, you are. And for the last minute and a half to 2 minutes, you haven't done anything to make it worse. These skills are working because that's the idea. Not to help them feel better. The idea is to make sure they're not making things worse, that they're not picking up that gas can and pouring it on the fire. Intense exercise is often helpful. At least for me, I have an exercise routine of running. And when I get really upset and frustrated and I can't figure some things out, I go and I put on my running shoes and I say, goodbye, family. You need to give me 20 minutes. I just need to go out and do some intense exercise. And when I'm done, whether it's running, whether you have a yoga program, whether you spin, whether you do anything that does intense exercise, what feeling do we get when we're done with a really hard workout? Oh, I'm glad I finished, right? Our endorphins kick in our body, and our endorphins kick in and reduce the severity of emotions that we experience. That's a good thing. That's what we're trying to do. And in that 20 minutes, I didn't make things worse. Again, important to think about that. The idea is not to have you feel better. If you do, icing on the cake. The idea is actually to make sure that you're not pouring gas on the emotional fire. The last one is paced breathing. This kicks in the parasympathetic nervous system as well. This is where we exhale longer than we inhale. So if you inhale for 4 seconds, you exhale for 6. If you inhale for 3 seconds, you exhale for 5. You inhale for 7 seconds, you exhale for 10. And so trying to help out in that regard is going to be helpful. Question here, how do you know when to get help if someone is suicidal? We're going to simply ask, right? I'm wondering, you seem really upset and agitated. I'm wondering if you're thinking about suicide. I would add one piece there. You and I have talked to each other for the last 6 months. I care about you. You've been one of my best friends for the last 3 years. So I'm going to show that I care. And I'm going to ask the question, are you thinking about hurting yourself or are you thinking about suicide? I am going to use the word suicide because I don't want there to be a stigma. And if they are thinking about it and you're not an expert, you don't have any mental health training, then the last question of the 3 is, I know where we can go to get help. So let's go down and talk to the school psychologist. Let's go talk to a caring parent. Let's go talk to somebody and I'll go with you. That's where we can do those things. And so through those 3 major points, Harry Brown will probably cover this a little bit in the LEARN model, but we show that we care. We ask the question of self-harm, suicidal behavior. Do use the word suicide, right? Because self-harm and suicide are different. And then we refer. We know where to get help if that's the case, if they are saying yes to that. And if they say, no, you got to be crazy, you simply want to say, it's okay. And if you're having some of those thoughts at another time, I want to be here for you, right? We don't want to say, oh my God, no, I'm not thinking that. We want to get rid of that stigma. All right, next question. Sorry, next slide. Yep, another one. Here we go. The change side. So the other side of the teeter-totter or seesaw that we call them out on the East Coast are the change skills. This is where we've got to check the facts. Is my perception of really what's happening true? Check the facts. If the facts do not fit the situation, I've got to do the opposite of what my action urge is, and I'll explain that a little bit. And then or if they do fit the facts, I might have to sit with it. So next slide. Keep in mind that we're over on the change side of the continuum only when our emotion thermometer is below 65, all right? So checking the facts, we got to figure out, did I interpret what I saw, what I heard, what I felt correctly, or is there a different interpretation? So somebody bumps you in the hall and your immediate thought is, oh, that ass, they did that on purpose. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they got pushed and they bumped you because that was just a chain reaction. They didn't do it on purpose. Would our emotion be different if we knew it was an accident versus them doing it on purpose? The answer is yes, likely would be, because our interpretation is different, right? And so we've got to check that. Did that person break up with me because they want to date somebody else? That could be one interpretation. Maybe that person broke up because they're really struggling and they can't give the relationship its time. Maybe they broke up with the person because the person wasn't a very good partner, wasn't treating them well. Maybe you didn't get invited to the party because you weren't part of the cross-country team versus they just don't like me, right? The interpretation of what that is going to change how we feel. And so when we check the facts, we have to ask ourselves, could I interpret this? Could a set of circumstances be different than how I'm interpreting and get me to the same spot? Could it get does it explain the same behavior? If yes, then we should do what we call opposite action. So opposite action says, if you're angry, you have an urge to usually attack. And if you're sad, you have usually an urge to pull back and become isolated. If there's a different set of circumstances that explain those facts, then you actually have to act opposite to the emotional urge that your body's telling you. So if I'm angry at somebody because they purposely shouldered me in the hall, instead of attacking them and swearing at them, because that's what I want to do, I want to attack, the opposite action is I need to withdraw. I need to be nice. And guess what happens as soon as I'm nice and withdraw? My intensity of my emotion goes way down. My urge to attack goes way down because my behavior is telling my body something different because I've acted differently than what my mind was telling me I should do. Same thing happens for sadness, right? People that are sad or people that are depressed, they want to do nothing, right? They just kind of want to sit and lay around and sleep or just be on social media. That's the urge. If the facts don't fit the situation, they have to act opposite. So what does that mean? That means they have to go out for a walk. That means they have to call somebody and socially engage. They need to go to a party, right? And as soon as they start doing those things, guess what happens? The intensity of the emotion goes down again because their body's acting opposite to what their mind's saying. So it's a great way, it's a very quick and effective way to bring some of those emotional urges down, right? If the facts don't fit that situation. Keep in mind, we're under 65 again, right? So we're trying to change the intensity of the emotion. All right, next slide. What happens when they do interpret it correctly? What happens if somebody did intentionally bump into them or somebody intentionally didn't invite them to the party? Yes, that sucks, right? We can validate that. That's not good, right? If the facts do fit the situation, we use a skill called wave skill. Because we know that emotions only last 60 to 90 seconds. That's the physiological length of an emotion. So how is it I can stay angry at my partner for at least days? Because I keep refiring it and refiring it and refiring it. How can I stay angry at an ex for that long? Same type of thing, right? So if I stop refiring it though, the emotion is going to come in like a wave and it's going to go back out. And so that whole process is roughly 60 to 90 seconds. So if the situation fits the facts that you're sad because you broke up with a partner that you've had for 6 months, yeah, that is a sad situation. And if I'm a parent and I have that adolescent, I'm going to sit with them. If they're crying, I'm going to hand them a Kleenex and cry with them. You bet, that's a sad situation. Not there are other fish in the sea. That's invalidating. You're right. You really like that person. You gave it your all. It was your first love. Yeah, that's sad. Let's sit with it. You're right. I'll cry here with you. Somebody's in a car accident and you're scared. Yeah, that's a scary situation. The facts fit. Car accident, scared. They're up at the hospital in the ER. I'll sit with you. You're right. That emotion's tough. So we want to give our adolescents permission to experience those emotions, even though the physiological feeling we don't care for. And it's so important about that because right now as parents, we're so used to protecting our kids because when they're really small, we didn't like it when they were crying. We didn't like it when they had emotions that gave them lousy physiological feelings. So we've gotten very used to trying to solve all those issues. When now they become adolescents, some of those issues make sense. What we don't usually like and what we're not usually used to is the physiological response that we have in our bodies. We don't like what our bodies tell us. And yet sometimes it's okay to sit with them. It's okay to be anxious before a competition, before a test. It's okay to be anxious when you're asking somebody out on a date. That'll be important. All right. So is suicide related to impulsiveness? David Klonsky is going to say no to that. And even Thomas Joyner's model suggests it doesn't happen. Those components of thwarted belongingness and perceived burdensomeness don't happen immediately. All right. David Klonsky says there has to be long-term pain that's been going on. Yes, people can get very emotional quickly, and it doesn't mean that they can't be rash in their decision making. What is rash though is that they have the suicide plan, their method in the back of their minds, and what they do is they impulsively grab it. So that they have the aspirin that they need, they have the alcohol that they need, whatever that is, a knife for cutting. And so they impulsively may grab that strategy. It's not that they all of a sudden thought that, okay, my life sucks because someone just broke up with me, I'm suicidal. That doesn't happen in 2-3 minutes worth of time. Hopefully that helps. All right. So impulsivity is not a major component that's there, other than it grabs the strategy that they've already been thinking about. The wave skill here says sometimes we have to sit with sadness. So really important here is that we are all still in the pandemic. It is sad that my son is going to miss his 8th grade graduation. Yep. So that fits the facts. He hasn't been able to go out with some of his friends. So we sit with that and we talk about it. And it helps reduce some of the emotion, right? And so some of those things are important, that we help our kids learn to sit with emotions that often don't feel well, all right? Next slide. Finally, one of the things I want to talk about is that we can do things for ourselves and help our adolescents to take care of themselves so they're less likely to give into emotion mind, less likely to have emotion mind take hold. And these are what are called our please skills. And this is a mnemonic device as well. So we've got physical health. None of us often are just as patient with each other, partners, or with our adolescents when we're not feeling well. When we're sick, we tend to be grumpy, right, and grouchy. When we limit screen times, right now I've got 2 adolescents, asking them to come off the Xbox or their screens when they've been on it for like a couple of hours. Oh, they bite my head off. They're, I'm like, whoa, that is not my child. We're going to limit screen times here. So we try to do that in our household. If they ask to go on the screens, we say yes. And at what time are you coming off that screen? Set a timer. And so we have a timer there. We know this, and none of these please skills are rocket science, right? We know that eating well, and how many of us eat well, a balanced diet, all 3 meals? I don't, right? There are times that I don't. We do know that if we can eat balanced meals, we tend to feel better. And if we feel better, we have more patience. We tend to experience happiness more. We overindulge, all right? Avoid the overindulgence. That does not mean you can't have a glass of wine. It does not mean you can't have a beer or 2. What it means is having 6 might be overindulging. Having too many drinks or too many drugs is overindulging. We lose our wise mind at that point. All right. How many of us get 8 hours of sleep all the time? Not a lot. And our adolescents are going to bed now at 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, and they're having to get up at 8, 8:30, right? They're not getting enough sleep. And so they're usually groggy. They're grumpy in the morning. I've got one of those, right? Hard to get them out of bed. And then exercise daily. We know all about this. How many times do we exercise daily, get our 20 to 30 minutes of exercise in every day? Those skills help us be less vulnerable to our emotions. So we call these these are the vulnerability factors. The skills, the please skills help us be less vulnerable to the emotions. Next slide. So we come back to interpersonal theory of suicide. Next slide, here it is. And I'm going to show you some of the skills that we can use that are in the Steps 8 curriculum. Keep in mind, I have a bias to the curriculum. Next slide. So for thwarted belongingness, trying to help our adolescents see that, yes, they have a lot of value. Yes, they're important in relationships. We have what's called our interpersonal effectiveness skills. So our dear man skill, our fast skill, our accept skill, which is actually a distress tolerance skill. And then sometimes we have to radically accept that we're not on the cross country team, that we weren't good enough to make the football team, that I'm not part of the cheerleading squad, that I'm not in band, and that this one group of people don't like me. I can radically accept it. One of the radical acceptances that we're doing right now is we're in the middle of a pandemic. We've had to radically accept that the pandemic's here. And as much as we say that stinks, it shouldn't be that way, that's pouring gas on the emotional fire. You're right, it does stink. And that's how it is. That's the reality of where we are right now. Next slide. So to help shrink the perceived burdensomeness, we've got some of our change skills, right? Check the facts. Is my perception really accurate? Am I thinking about this the right way, or is there an alternate explanation that would help me out? If there's an alternate explanation, then I have to do the opposite action of what my urge is. If the facts do fit the situation, if my interpretation is correct, then I need to sit with this emotion that doesn't feel very good. I'm going to do the wave skill. And finally, one of our accepting reality skills, a distress tolerance skill, is turning the mind. I'm going to come back to, yes, it's the pandemic. Yes, this is the pandemic. Yes, I'm not in this relationship anymore. Yes, school stinks. I'm going to keep turning my mind back to the reality of the situation. So I'm not doing the would've, could'ves, and should'ves. I'm not pouring that gas on the emotional fire. Next slide. Finally, what do we do about reducing the capacity to engage in suicidal behavior? We use mindfulness. That's where we get our emotional thermometer reading. We use our mindfulness to say, where am I? And if I'm a 65 or higher, okay, time to stop making decisions. I need to go distract and do something different. I need to change the high intensity emotion that's there. I need to not make important decisions like calling up my partner or any financial decisions or blowing up with my parents. I need to do something that's going to help me distract and change my focus so that this emotional intensity comes down. We have our tip skill that we talked about. The accept skill is a distraction. So accepts is a mnemonic device as well. Each letter stands for different ideas of how we can help our adolescents distract. So one of them, the A, is activity. So maybe you take your dog for a walk. Maybe you write a letter to somebody, right? And then the fast skill is an interpersonal effectiveness skill where we're being true to our own values. We're not engaging in things that go against our goals, go against our norm of who we are, right? So if I'm an athlete and I don't engage in drinking, then I don't go out and start having 3 or 4 beers, because that's going to take away my natural adaptation skills, and I don't want that to happen, right? That's only going to make things worse. Next slide. So we applied it to Thomas Joiner's model, and the idea being there is that if we make each of the circles smaller, the overlap that's in the middle is also smaller. There's less likelihood someone's going to make a suicidal attempt. On David Klonsky's model, this is the decision-making process model, the 3 steps. And so we got to try to figure out, where do we put skills in each one of the steps? So next slide. So here, we want to use, if you're in a lot of emotional pain and things seem hopeless, this is where you're so tempted to put the gas on the emotional fire. We're not going to do that. We're going to leave the gas can over there. So we're going to use our distress tolerance skills. We're going to use TIP. We're going to use our distraction of accepts. And then the third one in this one is what we call pros and cons. It's a distress tolerance skill as well. We're going to force our frontal lobe to come back online by looking at the pros and cons of a behavior. And so once we start to do that, the amygdala gives up some of its energy, gives up some of the emotion mind that's there, and we start thinking more rationally and more logically. And as soon as we're starting to be able to do that, that emotion is going to come down, and we can start to use some of our other skills. Next slide. Interpersonal effectiveness skills is the connectedness skills. So our dear man is getting the things that we want, being more effective in asking for the things we want, and also saying no to the things we don't want. No, I do not want drugs. No, I don't want to try a bowl or a joint, right? No, I'm not going to give you the car. Those types of things. Our give skills is another mnemonic device regarding relationships, and that V and give is for validate. Validate what the person's experiencing. That will build connectedness. And the fast skills, again, we just talked about them, are the skills that allow us to be making decisions and truthful to ourselves. So the T in fast actually is truthful. The S is stick to your values. The A is don't over apologize, or don't apologize if you don't need to apologize. And the F is actually to be fair. And so here we're trying to make decisions from our wise-minded point of view. And we know what when we make a wise-minded decision. Our gut kind of just says, yep, that's good. Glad you said no to that second drink. Glad you didn't get in the car being impaired. Glad you called or texted a parent to say, I need some help. Those are wise-minded decisions, all right? And our body usually tells us when we're making decisions from wise mind. Next slide. The last one is, are you capable again? Radical acceptance. The situation is what it is. If we try to push it away and try to say, no, it shouldn't be that way, we struggle, right? Radical acceptance, I'll give you a really quick example of this. Radical acceptance is what happens in the Super Bowl when you're supposed to win it, and for some reason you run the wrong play. Does that sound familiar to anybody that lives in Seattle 3 years ago or 4 years ago? We hosted a Super Bowl party that year, and everybody was just depressed at the end of that game, and like slamming down their drinks, and this is the worst party ever, and hard to radically accept, right? And it's taken a while, so we have to keep going back to radical acceptance. Yes, that really happened. Yes, that really happened. And the more we said that shouldn't have done that, they should have just run the ball, it fueled our frustration, all right? And so that's one of the skills. Checking the facts in opposite action. That is also one that helps us stay more in our wise mind, because we're going to do things that are opposite of our interpretation, because the interpretation may not be correct, or there's an alternative interpretation. And then the wave skill. Maybe our interpretation is right. Maybe the facts do fit. I'm going to sit with the emotion. And I'm not going to get in some dangerous place, not engage in dangerous behaviors. I'm going to sit with it because the emotion I'm experiencing fits the facts. That'll be important. Okay, next slide. So that's what I have for you. This is a really quick version of providing skills on both the acceptance side and the change side of the dialectic to help with emotional regulation. So I am open for questions. I think Dave's got a few more slides here to go through, and please feel free to ask questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Mazza. We do actually have a few questions for you. Let me just get those pulled up. The first one talks actually about your book. Yeah. Can you talk about the lessons in your book? Most students I know in middle and high school balk at social emotional learning lessons. They say they are boring, stupid, unrealistic. Most of the tools we have don't feel super useful by that age. They feel appropriate for younger kids, though.
Yep, and that is so true. Whoever wrote that question already has some experience. It's true. Most of our social emotional learning programs are written for elementary level. There's no question. Matter of fact, the plethora of programs, there's like 20 programs approved by a national organization called CASEL for elementary. There's 6 of them that are approved for middle school and only 5 for high school. So you're actually spot on. The exercises that they have kids do are also pretty elementary. So by the time the kids get to be 12, 13, 14 years old, they're like, done. This is for 4th graders. I don't want this. Our book was written specifically for the adolescents, and the curriculum talks about issues regarding drug use, regarding dating, regarding tattoos, regarding how to be a better partner, those types of things, issues that adolescents are going to experience. And so each one of our lessons gives examples that a middle schooler could relate to and a high schooler, because it can be taught at both levels. And so we try to make it more user-friendly in that regard. Some of the schools that have used it, Roosevelt's one of our schools here in the Seattle area, their kids have loved it. They're like, oh my gosh, can I come to this class again? And you're like, well, you have to put it in your schedule. You've already passed this class. And so we've had some pretty good success in that regard. So it looks a little bit more unique. And then the last thing there is that we focus specifically on emotion regulation rather than on the pro-social behaviors, rather than on getting good grades and being a better community person. Those are important. We totally agree. And if we're going to make an impact on self-harm and suicidal behavior, the core component is that emotional dysregulation. We saw it in Klonsky's model, and we see it in Thomas Joyner's model.
That's awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I do actually have a question as a follow-up to that.
Yeah,
sure. I mean, there's so much content that's both here in your presentation and in the book. Is there special training to teach the lessons from the book?
So yes, so it's not required. We certainly do. Liz and I, who are the first 2 authors, and Liz is my partner and wife, we do recommend that if people are going to be teachers of this material, that we have a 3-day training that we do. We have open trainings 2 to 3 times a year that you can look for. And so it is pretty intense. It's 3 consecutive days usually. And so you learn not only the content of the lesson, you actually learn how to teach it. And so we model the lessons, we teach them as if they're coming out of the book, and then we give you a chance to teach them back to us as part of kind of the training process.
Awesome, thank you. Do have another question. One person talks about what happens when it's too difficult to sit with. Maybe when these topics become too unbearable,
yep.
Or anything like that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, that's when it's beyond maybe your capability, and important for our friends to recognize that, because several schools in our area use a peer-to-peer model, meaning that the peers are used to hear what other peers are talking about and then report to a caring adult. And so one of the things that we want to make sure that we're doing in our peer-to-peer models is to educate our peers, our natural helpers, that they are not responsible for another person's life. We don't want a 15-year-old carrying that weight that every decision, every word that they say, it might make the difference of somebody dying from suicide. That is often not the case. What we want peers to recognize is like, oh my gosh, this is above my training, this is above what I can do. I need to go to this caring adult. I'm going to bring this person with me, or I'm going to go to a caring teacher, or I'm going to go to a caring psychologist or a school counselor. If you're not in school, if this is happening out in your community, then you're going to go to a caring parent. Usually, hopefully it's yours, right? And then be able to say, hey, I'm really worried about Joey or Janie. They're talking trash. They're talking about thinking about dying. I don't know what to do. And then that caring adult hopefully knows enough to contact the right people. There's resources. And I don't think I actually made that slide. There are resources that we can use for getting parents help. There's the King County Crisis Line. There's the National Suicide Prevention Line that we can also talk about. I think that that's actually in one of the slides that Dave, you have that's there. And so we want to make those numbers available for everyone, that there's not a stigma to ask for help. Asking for help and being vulnerable is actually a strength. Our kids are not getting that message sometimes from our parents, from our society, that they have to all go it alone. You have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's hogwash. I don't know whoever made that statement, right? That's not the case. And so we often lose kids because they feel like nobody cares, nobody's there to help them, right? And they're trying to figure this all out by themselves when that's next to impossible as an adolescent. All of us had caring people. That's how we got to be what's called adults.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right, and I can think of many of the times where I experienced those same things in my own personal life. I'm sure everybody else listening can do the same.
Me too, right? Absolutely.
Yeah. When you talked a little bit about when it becomes a larger thing outside of what maybe me as an everyday person or somebody else watching, and we turn to the people maybe in schools that are more trained. How do people get trained in terms of do you have trainings for schools to be able to implement their curriculum?
So we do trainings for schools. So that's one question. So yes, that's schools usually contact us if they want that. The forefront in the schools that we forefront in the forefront is an organization at the University of Washington that is for all of Washington State. We've been training. We're up to I think like 45 schools now in the King County, and actually I shouldn't even say King County, in the Western Washington area. We've had a couple of counties join us actually from the Eastern Washington. So we're getting pretty broad now in helping schools develop suicide prevention plans, suicide intervention plans, and then receiving some of this training. So our forefront schools are able to come to our 3-day training in Steps A for free. And so that's important. Schools also can reach out for different types of resources, and teachers, school counselors, social workers, school psychologists now have to all go through what's called continuing education credits to keep their certification. So Washington State is one of the very first states to require educational staff have to be trained on recognizing suicidal behavior and have to be trained on how do you do referrals when kids are at high risk. And so as a licensed psychologist, I have to do this every 5 years. It's a 6-hour training. As an general education teacher, they need 3 hours every 3 years, I believe it is. Could be 5. And then school psychologists, school social workers, same type of thing. So we've actually kind of set the edge for other states to follow in making sure our educational folks have received some of this training. And also the troubled youth law is what kind of started this. Our educational folks also have to get trained on sexual abuse, referrals for those situations, on substance use. And so those types of situations in which kids may be at risk for other types of behaviors, our teachers, school psychs, school social workers, school counselors are learning about that as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Got a question from Nori, and I believe you touched on this a little bit around excess, but maybe you could speak a little bit more to this. Can you speak to high school youth showing students or HYS showing students who reported vaping, smoking, and using tobacco may be at increased risk for using other substances and experiencing depressive symptoms and thoughts of suicide? Any thoughts on how to
Sure. So, one of the worries that we've had regarding the vaping, and that's kind of really blown up fast in the last 5 years. And we're starting to get on top of that, saying, wait, this is not just this harmless smoking. It's not harmless. And we're starting to see some data about that. The recreational marijuana use, that's been the big one. We're like, we got to get this out of kids' hands. How are we going to do this? And so we thought there'd be a sudden surge in recreational marijuana amongst high schoolers. And what has been interesting is that the Social Development Research Group out of the University of Washington has been able to show, since the passage of recreational marijuana, that the usage among youth hasn't gone up much at all. And I'm like, well, why is that? It has to go up. And I was talking to them in one of these forums. I'm like, that makes no sense to me. Of course they're going to be smoking. And he said, Jim, they were smoking long before this was legal. So they just had access to it already. So being legal versus illegal didn't matter to them. So they already had access to it. We do worry sometimes that it becomes what we call a gateway drug, that kids who start down this path are going to start to go into harder drugs that's going to increase the tolerance, and they're going to have to use more and more and more. So far, we've seen very little evidence that is occurring because they were already using these drugs. The vaping is a little bit different because it tells us they're more experimental. And if you're more experimental, you want to get that rush some other way, either more vaping or now a different drug. So yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And shifting a little bit from substance to a different part of this topic,
Yep.
What age do we generally start seeing suicidal behaviors in young children? When do these behaviors hit their peak, if there is any?
Yeah, so there actually is a bit of a peak. And so we see the suicide attempts, the first suicide attempts usually happening between 8th and 10th grade. We usually see the highest suicidal ideation prevalence rates roughly around 10th grade. And that's usually because kids have figured out school by then. It's their second year and into their third year, that junior year, where they now are bonded to a certain group of people. They're now bonded to their school. And so that connectedness piece starts to protect them a bit more. They're feeling less isolated. They've managed some of their early adolescence. They're managing the hormones in their bodies a little bit more. It doesn't mean they can't get upset. It doesn't mean they can't be moody. It just means that there's less of it. And then, so we have less of an issue. The thing that we have to be cautious about is we're going to get a group of students who are going to be kind of experimenting, trying to figure out who they are. And once they kind of figure that out at 15 and 16, they come back down in the risk level. There's going to be also a group of students, though, who are trying to figure out who they are, and they have a lot of these mental health difficulties that are going on, and they stay up there. They stay drinking. They stay high in their drug use. They stay high in their isolation. They don't seem to figure it out. That group is going to have mental health difficulties in their young adult life as well, and we worry about that group being much more chronic in their mental health issues versus a group that is a little bit more acute. They go up high, and then they get some help, and they come back down.
Thank you.
Yep.
Have another question. This time, what thoughts do you have to help parents with enhancing resilience when children are left at home all day while parents are at work? Yeah, could you speak to that?
Wow, that is a huge and tough question, one that a lot of our parents are facing. And so here's what I want to say is that resilience is something that we can build, right? Resilience is something that we want our parents to think about helping our students, our kids at home, structure their day, give them things to do that are not just all on the screen, right? So we want them, if they have to be on Zoom or Teams or whatever it is for school, we want to make sure that they're in class with their cameras on doing those things. And when they're not in the academic activities, what are they doing? Because that's when we worry that they go out and smoke, they drink, they start roaming the streets, right? So give them some things that they tend to do naturally. So if they like using their hands, maybe they can build a little mini library, or maybe they can do some chores around the house. Maybe you give them $15 to paint something or fix something or whatever else that is. And so find little incentives for them to do that are adaptive, that can use their motivation so that they're not feeling like my life stinks, it sucks, there's nobody that cares for me, and this pandemic is awful. So giving them some of that predictable structure will be important. And so if that means an extra $40 or $50 out of your pocket in a week or 2 weeks, maybe, is that $50 going to be worth it for you to not worry about them smoking or drinking or out with the wrong crowd? That's up to you.
I mean, it's a big question for sure.
Yeah, and I'm hoping come September, I'm hoping, fingers crossed, that we're going to have our kids going back to school so that we're going to not need to worry about this as much.
Because I mean, the YMCA has done a study through the YMCA Social Impact Center about distress, and it being a very unprecedented time, especially around behavioral health for young adults. So yeah, thank you. And shifting again a little bit.
Hey David, you brought up something that triggered a thought for me. If you've got adolescents and they're talking about going to college, having them go to the Y and volunteer looks fantastic on their resume. Colleges like that they're doing something different than gaming, and it gives them a lot of empowerment. It gives them leadership skills, gives them something to do when these other kids are looking at them saying, thank you, thank you, and thank you. And so I just think that's a win-win-and-win situation.
Are you sure you don't work for the Y? Because that was a beautiful plug for our volunteering, but thank you. Do you have any insight on suicidal behaviors in youth who have special educational needs or are nonverbal, disabled? How do parents detect these behaviors in youth who might not express themselves in ways that these methods are looking for?
Yeah, so parents of kids that may have special needs or aren't good at communicating verbally Yes, it's an extra challenge. So let me validate that, right? Yes, that sucks. Yes, it's hard for you. And there may be things that you can see in your child's pattern of behaviors that's changed. One of the keys for us to see, and you'll hear this from Harry Brown in, I think, 2 weeks when he talks about the LEARN model, is when there's a sudden change in a child's behavior, that's actually usually a risk factor, all right? That actually means that if they've gone from 2 beers to 2 6-packs they're drinking, or if they've gone from being depressed and sad for 8, 9 consecutive months and all of a sudden come way elevated, like just joyful and gleeful, even that's a risk factor, right? And so we want sudden changes in behaviors. That also is the case for our kids that may have special needs, or our kids that struggle being able to communicate with us. So find out ways, do things with them. Even just sitting with them is actually bonding to some of those kids. Finding ways that they can communicate to you. It might be playing cards, it might be drawing together, it might be watching some shows. Put your hand on their hand. Let them know that you care. Let them know that you love them. Small tokens of gratitude that your child and you are there. So it might be giving them their favorite cookie, or it might be giving them something that they appreciate, like extra time to watch a movie or a series that they enjoy on Netflix, something along those lines that you're thinking about purposefully. What is it that they would want? What's going to help them know? What's going to help tell them non-verbally that I love them?
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Have a couple other questions for you.
Yeah.
Again, shifting a little bit to biological factors. Are there any biological factors that may increase the risk of suicide, or maybe can the risk of suicide be inherited?
So the risk of suicide is inherited only through the broader umbrella of mental health being inherited, right? So we do know that there is some inheritance, right? We do have some heredity regarding some of our mental health disorders like depression, schizophrenia, anxiety, and so forth, right? Some of those, in substance use, right? So if you've got a hereditary predisposition for alcohol or for drug use, that's a risk factor. Not necessarily for suicide itself. We don't have any biological markers that we can follow that say that's a suicide gene. We don't have that one, right? We're much more accurate in some of the other mental health difficulties. And even then, if you have the predisposition of depression or anxiety or eating disorders or schizophrenia, it doesn't mean you automatically become suicidal. It simply means, okay, I'm more vulnerable to alcohol use. I'm more vulnerable for not processing that alcohol or drugs the same way somebody else is. What can I do to protect myself? What can I do to provide me with more coping strategies so I don't get caught in that spot?
Protective factors. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah.
When someone is using the DBT steps A, how long would you say it takes to maybe begin seeing changes taking place? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So we think the changes, and it's going to take a little bit of time. Changes are going to take place when the students start to say, you know what, these skills aren't so bad. Maybe this can help me out in these situations. It's easier for when we see some of our friends who struggle with mental health issues, when they're starting to show improvement, other kids are like, I want that. Whatever they're doing, I wanted some of that. So when our kids are more open-minded that these skills can help, and we hear from other kids who have used them effectively, it's going to increase the time. It's going to decrease the time in which they're going to see impact. If they're doubting like, this is stupid, this is ridiculous, and they're denying some of that, it's going to take a little bit longer. On the skills side, once they start being mindful of their situations, once they start to see how mindfulness works, like, oh, that makes sense. It makes sense that I was nervous asking somebody out on a date. It makes sense that now that I got put in the penalty box in hockey, that I can't do that. That's not a very good idea of mine, right? And so when they start to see them practice it, and one of the things that we do in the curriculum that I think is important is that we want the end goal to be kids practicing the skills. It's not if they can learn it. It's not if they can recite it. We want to see the behavior change. We know that knowledge gain does not equal behavior change. And we know that through our drug and alcohol prevention programs. The kids can recite, yeah, beer's not good. No, that's risky sex. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't. And then what do they actually do? They drink beer. They go out and have risky sex. And so we need to make sure that they're making behavioral changes along with the knowledge gain. And so we have this, what we call a diary card. It's like a ongoing weekly report card of themselves using skills, and then we ask them how effective they are. And so we're able to kind of coach kids then individually. If they're not effective in some strategies, let me see how you're doing it. Let me see what this looks like. And then we can give them coaching and just polishing so that that skill can be more effective when it's needed.
Thank you. Yeah. On a somewhat related note, do you think that once a peer dies by suicide, it sets off a chain reaction and increases death by suicide?
It can. So we call that a contagion effect. And so people, if we don't use our suicide postvention procedures, meaning that we don't go into the schools and talk about it and start to reduce the stigma, it actually exacerbates. It makes things worse for those others who are thinking about suicide. Interestingly, when a peer dies from suicide, the core group right around them actually reduces their suicide risk because they are so hurt. They are so upset. They're like, I'm never doing this to somebody. And so they want to stop it from happening. And often we hear about these students who are championing suicide prevention and some of these movements because they've lost a dear, dear friend. They don't want that to happen to anybody else in their class or cohort. So two different groups there, David. One, that if they're on the periphery and they're already struggling with mental health issues, they've already engaged in suicidal behavior. If we do nothing, it can exacerbate it. So you'll start to see more suicides. And we do see that. We do see some suicide clusters. And we're having some of those happening in the King County area right now. The core group, though, that really, really intimate group of friends, we often actually see them pulling together themselves, picking up each other and going like, oh my God, never again. This is so painful. We don't want anybody else to experience this.
I mean, I think that you speak a little bit to what you mentioned earlier. Kind of the protective factor is that if there are people tightly knit to come together, a community.
That's right. That belongingness is there. Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Connected.
Excellent. And as we start to wrap up on our time, do have one last question for you.
Yeah.
A big topic right now is equity and justice.
Yes.
Do these models currently account for use by BIPOC, LGBTQ, other populations? How do marginalized youth experience suicidal behaviors versus other youth?
Yeah, so both theories are being evaluated and examined for our BIPOC communities, looking at equity, right? And the issue that we see happening is that our students of color, our BIPOC communities, often don't trust the system that's already in place. So them reaching out for help is a much harder thing to do because we as society have made it harder for them to do that, right? That we're going to judge them or they're going to think that it's a family issue, whatever else. And so they don't trust sometimes the mental health service system that's in place. And that makes it harder for them to ask for help. And so if it's harder for them to ask help, harder for them to engage, harder for them to say, I'm suffering from anxiety or whatever else, then they're not going to get some of that help. And so I think we have to work on ways that suicide, the components that are there, the thwarted belongingness, the perceived burdensomeness, that happens for all of our kids. It happens for a lot of our adults, right? Connectedness is connectedness. One of the protective factors that's often happened in especially the Black population is they've been connected with these multi-generational families. And the suicide rate of our Black community is actually lower than it is for our white community because of that, some of that safety net that's underneath some of these kids. And so we have to really think about what that looks like. Same thing with our Latinx populations. They have extended families and really tight-knit nets underneath some of their kids. And so the suicide rate's lower. And so I think accessibility and how we make it equitable for people is important. And this is one of the reasons why, you know, our curriculum is like, we don't know who's going to be at risk. What we can tell you is every kid, doesn't matter what color skin they have, doesn't matter their background, all of our kids are going to struggle at some point. So why not give them struggling strategies ahead of time, put them in the toolbox, give them coaching to make sure that they work before that struggle happens. That's kind of where we're coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that last part particularly. I use Dear Man, in my own daily life, and so no matter who you are or where you come from, having these tools available to you, these mindfulness skill sets, you can take them anywhere with you.
I use Dear Man on my kids when I wanted them to do something, right? We use these skills all the time in our family, and so they're just not youth skills. These are lifelong skills, and why not teach it to the kids when they're the most vulnerable? Often is during that adolescence time when they're trying to figure themselves out.
Thank you. We so appreciate you agreeing to speak with us today and present with us. It really has been a pleasure to have you. And yeah, thank you so much. And for everybody else that's watching right now, if you're interested in learning more about everything that Dr. Mazza is doing right now, we will have a website available in the link for you to follow up with. We will also be sending it in an email as a follow-up to this webinar. As a reminder to everybody, we will be hosting Understanding Grief After Suicide on March 9th, and Dr. Mazza did mention the Learn Forefronts Suicide Prevention Training on the 17th of March. More information is on our website or in the follow-up email from this webinar. Thank you to everyone who was able to attend, and thank you to everyone for watching. If you're inspired by this work and want behavioral health services accessible for everyone, please visit our donate page to see how you can support this work in a way that is meaningful for you. And as in addition, just make sure that you and the people that you care about or people that you know are safe, and we will provide resources as a follow-up to this so that you have them in your back pocket just in case. But thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Have a good night.